Hi students, in this video I want to talk a bit about examples, thought experiments, and counterexamples. In particular, we're going to talk about how to come up with these sorts of things. So why we're interested in examples, thought experiments, and counterexamples is that when we're making arguments, providing evidence for them, trying to criticize them, we're going to need some way of providing support or criticizing, and examples, thought experiments, and counterexamples are going to be one way to do that. All right. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about experiments in general. So say I'm a scientist and I want to test the safety of a vehicle. In that case, I would run a series of experiments. In those experiments, I might ram the vehicle into various objects at various speeds, being sure to test it not only in conditions where it was likely to succeed, that is, keep its passengers safe, but also in conditions where the vehicle is likely to fail. By the end of this experiment, or these series of experiments, I would have a better sense for the sort of impacts that the vehicle could and could not safely sustain. So that would give me some information about the safety of the vehicle. Now, in the same way that we test empirical claims about, could this vehicle survive a 50-mile-an-hour crash into something, like X? In the same way that we test those empirical claims with experiments, we can test moral claims with what we'll call thought experiments. So imagine that I'm thinking about taking some paper from the copy room and giving it to my daughter, right? So, at any job, you have resources around maybe that you think, oh, I'll just take some of these things and I'll use it for myself. When I worked worked at a country club, whatever, when I was younger, there was some sense that you could take a snack every once in a while, but exactly how many snacks can you take was a question that I think occurred to me with some frequency. So did I ever take more than my fair share? Well, I don't know about that, but I know that this kind of question is just maybe a kind of commonplace one that a lot of people probably face in their jobs. So let's say I want to figure out whether or not it'd be okay for me to take some paper from the copy room and give it to my daughter. To know whether that would be permissible, morally speaking, I can't just take the paper and see what happens, right? That's actually not going to answer my question. Maybe I get in trouble, maybe I don't. But even if I do get in trouble or I don't get in trouble, the question that I had from the beginning wasn't, will I get in trouble for doing this? The question is it morally okay for me to do this? And I think that's kind of a separate question. So I need some other way to get about figuring out the answer. I can't just decide this empirically. Now, there might be some question like, will I get in trouble if I take the paper? That's an empirical issue, but is it morally permissible for me to take it? That's not an empirical issue. There might be some temptation to think that, well, there's just no answer to that question, but I want to resist that temptation. There are a lot of moral claims that I think can be shown to be either true or false without any, sort of independent of the empirical facts, just by looking at these sort of thought experiments. So anyway, let's take a look. So I might begin trying to answer this question by constructing a kind of argument for my conclusion. So here's a premise that I might have in my argument. I might say this: taking some paper from the copy room and giving it to my daughter would make her happy. Premise 2 says, if an act makes my daughter happy, then it's morally permissible. Conclusion, therefore, taking some paper from the copy room and giving it to my daughter is morally permissible. So we've already learned a little bit about constructing valid arguments. So there's this act, taking paper, giving it to my daughter. That would have this empirical feature, would make her happy. If an act makes my daughter happy, then it's permissible, morally speaking, for me to do. Conclusion, taking paper from the copy room and giving it to my daughter is permissible. So that has that principle, it's a kind of principled argument, that sort of A, E, arrow M, therefore A, arrow M structure. So now that I have a valid argument, I need to evaluate its premises. If both premises are true, then the argument is sound. So let's take each premise at a time, right? The first premise, taking some paper from the copy room and giving it to my daughter would make her happy. This is an empirical claim, which is just to say that it's the sort of claim that we could test with an experiment, right? So I could take some paper from the copy room, I could give it to my daughter, I could find out how she reacts. Is she happy, is she not? Note that what makes this an empirical claim is not that we've run the experiment or that we know whether it's true, but rather that we could, at least in principle, figure out whether it's true with an experiment. So that's what makes it an empirical claim. Not that we actually know for sure, but just that we could figure out whether it's true or false by, doing it. For our purposes, let's just assume that's true. So let's all assume, like, okay, yep, if John takes this paper from the copy room and gives it to his daughter, then she'd be happy. Premise 2 is a moral claim. So if an act makes my daughter happy, then it's morally permissible. Although we can use experiments to test premise 1, we can't use an experiment or set of experiments to test premise 2. So I can't, run any sort of empirical test to find out whether acts that make my daughter happy are all morally permissible or not. As I say here, right, that's because it's not an empirical claim about how the world is. It's a moral claim about how the world should be. It doesn't say, like, then you should do this thing, but it is the claim not about how things are just on a descriptive level. It's a claim about how they are at sort of a normative, moral level. In order to provide support for moral claims like this one, or to criticize them, well, I guess here I'm just saying, in order to provide support, we need to use examples or thought experiments. If we want to criticize or refute them, we're going to need to use counterexamples. And so what we're going to do in this video is go through some examples and sort of teach you how to do that thing. Okay, so sometimes I'll use the word example broadly to just refer to a particular instance of a more general phenomenon. So, X is an example of Y. It's an instance of a general phenomenon. But when I'm using the word example here, I'm using it in maybe a more narrow sense to refer to something like an actual instance that provides support for a premise of an argument. So an example is something that maybe actually happened that provides evidence in support of a premise, specifically a moral premise. So here's an example of an example that provides support for this premise. So when I pushed my daughter on the swing the other day, or years ago, when I pushed my daughter on the swing, that generally makes her happy, and it was morally permissible. This is providing support for this premise. How? Well, because it's a case, which we'll talk about later, that makes the antecedent of the conditional true. It's an act that makes my daughter happy, and it's an act that's morally permissible. So I pushed my daughter on the swing, that made her happy. That makes the act pushing her on the swing, makes her happy. Okay, and it was morally permissible for me to do. There's nothing wrong with it. This is the photo my wife took. Actually, this is now years ago that this photo was taken, but I really like this photo. I think it's cool, and my daughter is sort of really happy flying through the air on the swing. All right, so say we don't want to give an example, we want to give a thought experiment. Maybe we can't think of any actual instance of a thing that made our daughter happy that was also permissible. We can just come up with some sort of hypothetical case that provides support for a premise of an argument. So as I say here, the difference between an example and a thought experiment is that thought experiments refer to hypothetical instances as opposed to actual ones. So they're just sort of imaginary. They're thought up, not real things that happen. So here's a hypothetical. Giving my daughter some Sour Patch Kids would make her happy, and it would be permissible. So if I had some Sour Patch Kids, which I love, by the way, you want to score some brownie points, right? Give me some Sour Patch Kids. That'd be great. I'm just kidding. You shouldn't feel like you have to give me Sour Patch Kids. But no, I do like them. So anyway, enough about that. If I gave my daughter some Sour Patch Kids, that would make her happy, and it would be permissible to do. Sounds right. This is true even if, I've never done it before. I'm just sort of imagining, kids like sugar. Sour Patch Kids are similar to other things that they like, so let's say they would. Now, whereas examples and thought experiments are providing support for premises of an argument. So we just looked at an example, right, the swing one. We looked at a hypothetical like the Sour Patch Kid one. Counterexamples refute the premises of an argument. So they're used to provide evidence against them. And in fact, a good counterexample isn't just evidence, but I would say it's proof that the moral claim is false. So counterexamples can be either actual or hypothetical instances. It doesn't really matter. So I sort of draw a distinction between examples, which are real, and thought experiments, which are fictional, when it comes to support. But when it comes to what counts as a counterexample, well, it's anything that provides any example, real or hypothetical, that provides evidence against the claim. So here's a counterexample. So giving my daughter a bag of Sour Patch Kids every day would make her happy, but it wouldn't be morally permissible. Why not? Well, I guess if she didn't eat them, that would be fine. But it does seem like if I was giving her a bag of Sour Patch Kids every day, especially if she's not giving those away and she's just eating all the Sour Patch Kids, that's probably not good for her health. And so it wouldn't be a good thing for a parent to do. It'd probably be wrong, morally speaking, to do that. So that shows that just because something makes my daughter happy, it's not morally permissible to do. So what a good counterexample does, as we'll talk about more in a minute, is that it makes the antecedent of the conditional true. This act makes my daughter happy, but it's not morally permissible. And that shows that this conditional claim is false. All right, so here we've just got the argument, the whole argument that we've been looking at. And as I say here, right, even if the first premise of the argument is true, let's grant that giving my daughter some paper from the copy room would make her happy. The second premise is false. Just because something makes my daughter happy doesn't mean it's morally permissible. And so the argument is unsound. What that means, practically speaking, right, is that unless I can give a better argument for my conclusion, unless I can come up with some better reason for thinking that it'd be okay for me to do this, then I'm not justified in taking the paper from the copy room to give to my daughter. So I need to come up with a better reason, a better kind of justification for doing this act if I am going to be justified in thinking that it's morally permissible to do. So let's sort of dig down into the nitty-gritty here a little bit. So here's another argument. So premise 1, Bill Clinton lied. Premise 2 says if someone lied, then they did something wrong. Conclusion, therefore Bill Clinton did something morally wrong. And I know, kids these days, right? Bill Clinton, you were probably, Bill Clinton probably wasn't even president when you were born, potentially. So he's maybe before your time. But you probably are aware of Bill Clinton having this sort of famous scandal with Monica Lewinsky, and Bill Clinton says something like, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, which later came out that that was not true. He knew it wasn't true. He was trying to deceive people here. And so I think in that case he was clearly lying. And it's plausible, right, that if someone lies, then they did something wrong. So it does seem plausible. Not legally wrong, but it seems pretty plausible that when Bill Clinton told that lie, he did something morally wrong. Now, this argument's valid. It has this sort of principled argument, valid principled argument structure. You know, in this case, it's not an act. It's sort of a person that did this thing, and if a person does that thing, then it has this moral property. Therefore, Bill Clinton's behavior had that moral property. So this argument's valid, but is it sound? Now, we're going to grant premise 1 that Bill Clinton lied. The more interesting question is premise 2 true? Is it true that if someone lied, then they did something morally wrong? Now, we want to see that we can provide evidence in favor of this claim, and we can provide evidence against it. So most conditionals are going to be such that you can give evidence for them and evidence against them. And the ones that I am asking you about to use as practice, you should be able to come up with examples or thought experiments for and counterexamples against. But some conditional claims, right, if they're true, then you shouldn't be able to come up with a counterexample to them. So I'm going to try and avoid those. Right? The ones that I give you should be ones where you can often come up with an example or a thought experiment in support of it and a counterexample against it. But anyway, an example or a thought experiment is supposed to provide support for a conditional claim. So we need to try and give evidence to someone to think that this is true. So if I'm given an argument, right, and I assert premise 2, then I need to provide you with some support, some reason to think that if someone lies, then they've acted wrongly. How do I do that? Well, I use an example or thought experiment, and what it needs to do is it needs to make the antecedent and the consequent true. So what do I mean when I say antecedent? The antecedent of a conditional is that part that comes after the if, right? This part right here. That's the antecedent of a conditional. The part that comes after then is the consequent. So I put the one in red, the other in green. If someone lied, then they did something morally wrong. Someone lied, that's the antecedent. They did something wrong, that's the consequent. Both of those things need to be true in order for to give a good example or thought experiment. A counterexample, right, if I'm going to try and disprove this conditional claim, I need to make the antecedent true, but I need to make the consequent false. So I need it to be a case where someone lied, but they didn't do anything wrong. That would be a counterexample. It would show that this conditional claim isn't true. Okay, so for this particular example, if I want to give an example or a thought experiment that supports it, it needs to have two things. It needs to make the antecedent true, so it needs to be the case that someone lied. The example or thought experiment has to be an instance where someone lies, and it needs to make the consequent true, so it needs to be a case where that person did something morally wrong. Those are the two features that it needs. Someone has to lie, the antecedent's got to be true, and that person has to have done something wrong. The consequent has to be true. Now, you might, this is a time potentially where you want to pause the video and think, can you come up with an example? Can you come up with a thought experiment where that has these two features, where someone lied and that person did something morally wrong? So, you might say, John, I'm still not exactly sure what I'm trying to do. What you're trying to do is you're just, oftentimes one nice way to start is just with the word imagine. So imagine, and then you're going to describe a situation where someone lied and that person did something morally wrong. What's important here is that the example is specific. So if you're too vague, then the person reading it is not going to be convinced by it. So you want to make it specific enough that they can really be like, oh yeah, I can clearly see that in that case someone lied, and it's clear that what they did was wrong. You don't want to leave them wondering, well, maybe it was wrong, maybe it was right. You want to convince them that, yeah, In this case, someone lied and it was clearly wrong. No doubt about it. So if you want to try and do that, pause this video. But here's my example. So imagine that someone is allergic to peanuts and you give them a cookie that has peanut butter in it. They say, I'm allergic to peanuts. Does this have peanut butter in it by chance? And in response you say, nope, it doesn't have any peanut butter in it. That is messed up, man, right? In that case, you lied. You knew that it had peanut butter in it. Let's assume that you knew, right? Maybe I could improve my example, right? Because I think I say you've given them a cookie with peanut butter in it. I don't say that you know that the cookie you've given them has peanut butter in it. So maybe we need to add that in, right, to make it the example a little bit stronger, the thought experiment a little bit stronger. But anyway, I think that conveys the idea, right? Which is that in this case, you're lying and it's clearly wrong. And that supports this idea that whenever you lie, it's wrong. But say we don't want to provide support for it, right? Say somebody else is giving us this argument and we're like, oh, I'm not so sure. I think that this premise is false. So a counterexample that refutes this claim, right? It needs to make the antecedent true. Someone has to lie. It means the consequent false. They did not do something morally wrong. So what features do they need? It needs two features. It needs to make the antecedent true, so someone has to lie. And B, it must be the case that that person did not do something morally wrong. So both of those features. Again, this is maybe a good time to think about an example that you might come up with, right? What's a counterexample that you can think of where someone lies, but they didn't do anything wrong? A case where it's okay to lie. Here's my example. Imagine you're planning a surprise party for your partner who loves surprise parties. When he asks you whether you're planning a surprise party for his birthday, you say, no, I've been too busy to do that this year. So in this case, you're lying, but it seems like it's morally permissible to do it because how else are you going to, this person loves surprise parties, and how else are you going to give him a surprise party other than by lying? So I think, the power of this example, what this shows is that, if somebody uses a premise like this, premise 2, in an argument, then the argument's not a good one, right? They need a better argument. It's too general, right? Just because someone lies doesn't mean they did something wrong. And so we prove that with this counterexample. All right, now I want to run through some more practice. Again, we'll just sort of show you how you would answer the various questions that I might ask about these sorts of questions, and give you some examples of what a thought experiment, what a counterexample looks like. So here's a conditional claim someone might make. If someone disobeys their parents, then they did something wrong. Say we want an example or a thought experiment. What features does it need to have? Well, it needs to make the antecedent true. So somebody's got to disobey their parents. It's got to make the consequent true. That person has done something morally wrong. What would be an example of this? Maybe pause the video, come up with your own example. Here's one example that I came up with, right? Imagine your parents tell you not to bite your brother, but you do it anyway, just for fun. In this case, you've done something morally wrong, right? So here you've disobeyed your parents, you've done something morally wrong. That suggests that maybe every time you disobey your parents, it's wrong. But now say we want a counterexample. What do we need? Again, we need someone to disobey their parents. The antecedent needs to be true, but the consequent needs to be false, right? The person has not done something morally wrong. So can we come up with a case where someone disobeys their parents but hasn't done anything wrong? Right? Maybe you want to try that. Pause the video. When you're done, unpause it. My example. So my example is that imagine your parents tell you to steal from a certain homeless person, right? They say like, over there, go steal some money from that guy. But you don't do it. In that case, you haven't done anything morally wrong, right? Because your parents are telling you to do something wrong. That's precisely the kind of case where you should disobey your parents. You shouldn't obey them if they tell you to do something wrong. So this premise. What have we shown? Well, we showed that there's some evidence for the truth of this premise, but that ultimately it's got to be false because there's a counterexample to it. So we need to, if we're going to salvage this kind of argument that depends on this claim, we would need to modify that premise a little bit. Other examples, right? If someone tortures someone else, then they've done something wrong. What's an example? It needs to be a case where someone tortures someone else. And B, it's got to be a case where that person has done something morally wrong. What would a case like this look like? Think about it. Here's a hypothetical, right? Imagine you're waterboarding your little brother because you want to get his allowance. That would be morally wrong. Don't do that, right? So what this example, what this thought experiment, I should say, does, right? Presumably it's not an example. Presumably you haven't waterboarded your little brother before, hopefully. This thought experiment does is it shows us that when you torture someone, you're doing something wrong. You know, in at least some cases, maybe every case. One thing that I want to just point out here is that the examples are kind of specific, like waterboarding someone is wrong. That wouldn't be specific enough, right? Because it seems like there might be cases where waterboarding someone's okay. And I want you to sort of give me a precise enough example to get across the idea that, like, yep, definitely torture, definitely wrong. So waterboarding your little brother, you know, is that always wrong? Well, maybe not. But waterboarding your brother to get him to give you his allowance, yeah, that seems like it's wrong. So it doesn't seem like you got a good reason. But we can come up with a counterexample, I think. Right? What's a counterexample? What features does that have to have? Again, someone tortures someone else, but again, we've got to make the consequent false this time, so that person has not done something morally wrong, hasn't done anything morally wrong. Right? So what's an example of this? Say, imagine you're waterboarding a terrorist to get him to tell you the location of a ticking time bomb. That wouldn't be morally wrong. So this is a kind of case that philosophers have talked about. There's some controversy over whether or not you should do this, but it's at least plausible that this would be okay. And so you might use this counterexample to try and convince someone that, you know what, torture might be okay in some cases. Now, it might not be convincing to that person, but at least it's sort of a step in the right direction if you want to sort of debate or discuss this question of, is torturing always wrong? Well, the ticking time bomb scenario is a kind of scenario that's going to cast doubt on the idea that torturing someone else is always wrong. I've got some more examples, right? If you feel like, oh, John, I get it, I know what's going on here, then feel free to, to stop watching the video, or maybe just watch this example and then call it quits or whatever. But I've got a few more examples here I'll run through just in case they're helpful. What I want to note about this example, what I think is important about it, is that here what we're looking at is a principle that is sort of the main principle in one of the moral theories we'll be looking at. So according to utilitarians, right, if an act maximizes happiness, then it's permissible. Utilitarianism is a pretty plausible moral theory. So this this premise, a lot of people think that premises like this are true. We can give examples or thought experiments to provide support for them. What features does an example or a thought experiment in support of this need to have? Well, it needs to have an act to maximize happiness, and B, it's got to be true that that act is morally permissible. There's one really famous thought experiment that provides support for this. If you watch The Good Place, right, maybe you're familiar with this example. This example's gotten a fair bit of popular attention. It's called the trolley problem. So the idea is that you've got this trolley, racing down the track. It's headed for, in this case, 5 people, and you have a switch, and you could divert it. So you could flip the switch and have the train head down this other track where there's only one person. Should you flip the switch? The utilitarian thinks you should, right? So imagine, right, when we imagine this scenario where the train's headed towards 5 and you redirect it where there's only 1, it seems like you're doing something morally permissible. At least about 90% of people tend to think in this case that that would be morally permissible to do that. And so we're giving some support, right, for the claim that acts that maximize happiness are morally permissible. Now there's also sort of a famous counterexample to utilitarianism based on a pretty similar example. So again, a thought experiment to this, a counterexample to this claim is going to be one where the act maximizes happiness, but the act is not morally permissible. So what would an example like this be like? What would a counterexample look like? The famous case here is what we call the bridge case. So in this case, similar to before, we've got a trolley headed for 5 people, but in this case, you don't have a switch that where you can redirect the train. Rather, you're standing on a bridge with a very fat person, fat enough, large enough, that if you push this person off the bridge, they will slow down the train enough that it will save the 5 lives after it. So again, you might think this is kind of a bizarre scenario. I'm not sure that this could ever happen, but it's fair game, right? We're coming up with a counterexample, and it's hypothetical, right? It doesn't need to have actually ever happened. Just the thought that it could happen, the world could have this kind of scenario that you're faced with. What should you do there? So when we imagine this, when we imagine a train's headed towards 5 people, and you push a fat man off a bridge in front of the train to save those 5, it seems like you've done something immoral, something that's not morally permissible to do. And if that's right, then even though there are going to be some times where an act maximizes happiness, but it's not okay to do it. If that sort of provides us some evidence against utilitarianism, we can also look at more like Kantian principle. If we haven't learned about Kant in your class, and we will eventually, Kant's view is that we need to always respect each other's autonomy. And so if an act violates someone's autonomy, then it's morally wrong, according to Kant. If we want an example or a thought experiment that provides support for this, an act that violates someone's autonomy and is morally wrong. So what would an example that looks like this be? Again, maybe pause, try and think of your own. Here's an example. Imagine that your friend wants to watch Titanic in theaters, but you don't think they should, so you tie them up. You prevent them from going, right? That would be morally wrong. Again, note, this is just a, we're starting all these with this word imagine, right? It helps get us headed in the right direction. And I'm giving you enough details that to motivate the intuition. Right? Your friend wants to watch Titanic, but you don't think they should. You tie them up, right? If you just say, like, your friend wants to watch Titanic, but you stop them, that's too vague. Like, you haven't given me enough details. But now here, we're tying them up. Yeah, it seems like that would clearly be morally wrong. What about a counterexample? Can we think of a case that would disprove this conditional claim? Again, to do that, we need an example of an act that violates someone's autonomy. It makes the antecedent true, but it makes the consequent false. The act is not morally wrong. So what would an example like that be? Here's an example that I came up with, right? Imagine that your friend wants to rob a bank, but you don't think that they should, so you tie them up. That would not be morally wrong, right? This is very similar to the previous example, but there's an important difference, right? That if your friend wants to watch the Titanic, something that seems harmless, but you don't think that they should, you can't tie them up. But if your friend wants to rob a bank, it may be an action that's going to harm a fair number of other people, especially, right, if they say, well, I'm going to take a gun, and they're going to do it in an especially dangerous way, right? I think, if they're robbing a bank, that's a good enough reason to maybe try and stop them. But here, I mean, clearly we can add in some details. We can fiddle with the example if we want to. But I think you want to just make sure you've given enough details that gives the reader the sense that you want them to have, which is that this act would not be wrong to violate their autonomy. So when you tie them up in this case, it seems like, yeah, that would actually be fine to do. If they're trying to rob a bank, maybe you get to tie them up. Again, not every example or thought experiment that I give is maybe convincing to you, maybe not every counterexample I give is convincing to you, but the idea is roughly that it's going to be convincing to a large number of people. Like most people are going to find, I think, this example plausible, that says, yeah, sometimes you can violate people's autonomy if they want to do things like robbing a bank, etc. The last couple examples I'm going to give are just examples that are kind of motivated by certain classes that I teach, particular issues that I deal with in those classes. So here's one that I think is kind of a sort of common thought that people have out in the world. Right? The idea is something like this. They think, well, the First Amendment gives me the right to free speech, so I can say anything I want. Can we give support for that with an example or thought experiment? Yes. What do we need to give support? Well, we need it to be a case where the First Amendment gives us the right to free speech, right? So that's kind of easy to get. We just need it to be a case that like happens in America, US, something like that. And we also need to make the consequent true, right? We need to be that we can legally say something that we want to say. What would an example like this be? Really, we can pick anything that we're legally allowed to say would work here. So I'm going to pick something that's like kind of controversial, but it is legal to say it. So, right, imagine we think that police are racist, so we post F the police on Facebook, or we wrote a song that says that. That would be legal. But what about, are there counterexamples? Even though we have the right to free speech, are there things that we can't legally say? So here, again, we want to make the antecedent true. The First Amendment has to give us the right to free speech, so we're in the US, let's say. But now we need it to be a case where we cannot legally say the thing that we want to say. So what would an example of this be? Well, the most famous example of this might be a case where we yell fire in a crowded theater. The Supreme Court case sort of explicitly mentions this kind of example and says, you can't do that. That would not be legal. Why? Well, since it would incite a panic. It might lead people to be trampled or harmed in the process. So even though the First Amendment gives us the right to free speech, it doesn't follow that we can say just anything we want to say. And then as a final example, Peter Singer has this paper in which he argues that we have an obligation to donate money to famine relief. And one objection to this that people tend to give is one that appeals to this premise. Right? If someone works hard for their money, then they can spend it however they want, morally speaking. If we wanted to provide support for this, or a thought experiment in support of it, we need to make the antecedent true. Someone needs to work hard for their money. We need to make the consequent true. They can morally spend that money however they want. An example of this might be something like I've described here. So we've got a guy, Sam, who's a hardworking waiter. He makes more than enough to support his family. It would be permissible for Sam to spend some of his earnings on Precious Moments figurines, or a baseball, or something trivial, a snack, anything like that. We're giving enough details, right? He's a waiter, he's working hard, he makes more than enough to support his family. I'm sort of crafting, right, a vision of this person so that I can get you, the audience, to buy in to the moral permissibility of him buying some Precious Moments figurines. But there are also counterexamples, I think, to this claim. So I think this claim is ultimately false. What do we need for a counterexample? Well, we need someone who's working hard for their money, but who cannot, morally speaking, spend that money however they want. So what would an example look like here? Again, maybe you want to pause, try it out, see if you can come up with a good example. The example I sort of came up with off the top of my head is just Imagine some other person, Sally, who used their money to fund a terrorist organization like ISIS. Like, that would be wrong, even if her money was hard earned. So just because someone works hard for their money doesn't mean they can spend it however they want. Sometimes there are things you can't spend your money on. And I think what Singer's trying to get us to think is like there's sometimes where we have to spend our money in certain ways. So maybe an example where Sally is super rich, and there's someone who needs like a couple bucks so that he doesn't starve. It seems like Sally can't just say like, well, I worked hard for this money, I'm not going to share it, but she's got to help out, and that I think is the point the Singer is trying to make there. All right, so I've run through a bunch of examples. Hopefully that's helpful. What are the similarities between them? Just notice I've started all these with the word imagine. I think that sort of helps us get in the right frame of mind. We're imagining some scenario, and you need to describe it in enough detail where it's clear to me that the antecedent's true in both of these cases, right? If it's a thought experiment or an example, you want to give me enough detail so that I have the intuition that the consequent is true. Right here, for example, that the person can morally spend that money however they want, or at least spend it in some way that they want to. And then for the counterexample, we need to describe it in enough detail where it seems like, oh no, it would be wrong to spend it in this way that they want to. If you want some additional practice, right, there are some exercises provided in the document, one of the skill documents titled Examples, Thought Experiments, and Counterexamples. There's some practice there. And if you ever want to practice these skills in addition to what I've given you, I can come up with some more practice, right? So don't hesitate to do that. This skill is going to be really important not only for the homeworks coming up, but also in the papers that you're going to write. I'm going to ask you to come up with thought experiments and counterexamples, and so you want to know how to do this. You want to be more than capable of doing it on your own. So hopefully this is helpful, and we'll see you next time.